When did you discover your neighbor was watching/stalking you? I was 23 when I moved into my first apartment, a tiny one-bedroom on the third floor of an old brick building. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was decent, and I could finally escape my suffocating hometown. My neighbor across the hall was Theo, a quiet guy in his 40s who worked night shifts at the hospital. He seemed harmless enough, always nodded when we passed in the hallway, occasionally helped carry my groceries upstairs. "Nice girl like you shouldn't be living alone," he'd say, with what I thought was fatherly concern. The first red flag should have been how he always knew my schedule. When I mentioned working late, he'd nod and say, "Yeah, I saw your light was still off when I got home at 2 a.m. When I went out with friends, he'd ask the next day, "How was dinner at that Italian place downtown?" I assumed he was just observant, maybe lonely. Then my packages started disappearing. Not valuable stuff, just random deliveries that would vanish between the time they were dropped off and when I got home. I complained to the building manager, who installed security cameras in the lobby. The theft stopped immediately. That's when I noticed Theo had started timing his comings and goings with mine. If I left for work at 8:15, he'd suddenly emerge from his apartment at 8:14. If I came home late, I'd hear his door creak open right after mine closed. One night, I pretended to leave, but doubled back through the building's rear entrance. I crept up the back stairwell and peered around the corner. Theo was standing at my door, pressing his ear against it. When he heard nothing, he tried the handle. Then he pulled out a key. My blood went cold. I called the police from the stairwell, whispering into my phone, but by the time they arrived, Theo was back in his apartment, acting completely normal. The officers were skeptical. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing, just a feeling that something was wrong. Maybe he has a key from the previous tenant, one cop suggested. Talk to your landlord. My landlord, Mr. Rivera, went pale when I told him. He admitted that Theo had claimed to be doing maintenance checks for him, and yes, he'd given him a spare key months ago. "I thought you knew," Rivera said, horrified. "He said you'd requested it." That night, I changed my locks and installed a hidden camera. What I discovered made me sick. For 3 months, Theo had been entering my apartment while I was at work. The footage showed him going through my laundry, photographing my personal documents, and sitting on my bed while going through my phone, which I'd stupidly left charging on my nightstand. The worst part? He'd been replacing items in slightly different positions, making me think I was going crazy. My coffee mug moved from the left side of the sink to the right, books rearranged on my shelf, underwear folded differently in my drawer. I gathered everything and went straight to the police station. This time, they listened. The detective, a no-nonsense woman named Rodriguez, reviewed my evidence and immediately issued a warrant. When they searched Theo's apartment, they found a shrine. Photos of me sleeping, eating, showering, taken through windows with a telephoto lens, a detailed journal documenting my daily routines, my visitors, even my phone conversations he'd overheard through the thin walls, and copies of my keys to 3 other apartments I'd lived in over the past 2 years. "This wasn't random," Detective Rodriguez told me. "He's been following you for a while." Theo had worked at the hospital where I'd had my appendix out 2 years earlier. He'd copied my address from my medical forms and had been tracking me ever since. When I moved, he'd somehow gotten hired as a maintenance contractor at each new building. He was sentenced to 4 years for stalking, breaking and entering, and identity theft. The judge called it systematic predatory behavior. I moved across the state and changed my name. Now, 3 years later, I live in a secure building with doormen and cameras everywhere. I never leave my phone unattended, and I change my locks every 6 months, just in case. Sometimes I wonder how many other women he was watching. How many of us thought we were just being paranoid?